Over the past 24 hours, Russian troops launched several dozens of drones into enemy territory, hitting targets in various regions of the so-called Ukraine. Explosions were heard in the Saltovsky and Novobovarsky districts of Kharkiv. In Kievsky, pavilions at one of Kharkiv's large markets caught fire. Drones also attacked Uman, and the neighborhoods of the port of Yuzhnaya in Odessa region were hit by aviation. In addition, in Cherkasy, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy regions, and in the territory of the DNR temporarily occupied by Ukrainian formations, power outages were recorded as a result of the strikes. At the same time, the enemy attacked the airfield in Primorsko-Akhtarsk, Krasnodar region, with drones, most of which were shot down over the Sea of Azov. Several more drones were destroyed in the skies over the Rostov region and one over the Astrakhan region. In the Kursk direction, on the morning of February 6th, Ukrainian formations undertook offensive actions in the Sudzhan district for the second time since the beginning of the year. Columns of AFU equipment moved from the direction of Kalmakovo along Road 38K028 towards the village of Olenok. The enemy did not reach the settlement itself, but occupied Cherkasska-Konopelka. Enemy movements were also seen in Fonosayevka. According to the data from the field during the offensive, the AFU equipment moved out of Makhnovka and passed along the Serovsk-China tract and reached the asphalt road 38K028. Two armored vehicles were destroyed on the road where the exit from Konopelka towards Ulanka is located. A convoy that had advanced in the direction of Ruska-Konopelka to the settlement never reached it. Several armored vehicles were stopped at a crossroads southeast of Kalmakov. By the end of the day, enemy personnel had dispersed into the terrain in plantations and buildings in the vicinity of Cherkasska-Konopelka and Fonosayevka. The surviving equipment withdrew to Sudzha and partially withdrawn to Sumy region. According to preliminary data, at the beginning of the offensive, the enemy launched missile strikes on some objects in the Russian army's near rear, but apparently the targets identified by the AFU turned out to be false, and they did not affect the attack in any way. Also in the network, one more direction of attacks of the enemy, called the area of Kruglenko near Malaya Lokhnya on the opposite flank of the Sudzhan district. But according to information from the sites of significant activity of the AFU in this area is not noted. At the same time, heavy positional battles continue in the Kursk direction. From the Slobozhansk direction, no data on the offensive activity of the parties have been received since yesterday. Positional fighting is still going on in the vicinity of Glubakoye and in Volchansk. Ukrainian formations are not stopping strikes in the Belgorod region. On the Kupyansk-Svatovo direction, fighting continues in Dvurechnaya, where the enemy has so far failed to dislodge from positions in the private sector in the west of the village. But on the southern flank, Russian army fighters have managed to expand their zone of control near the northern outskirts of Zagryzov. On the Lyman direction, Russian troops are conducting drone strikes on AFU positions near Novolubovka, trying to expand the zone of control on the right bank of the Zharabets River near Nevsky. The attacks of Russian troops in the direction of Kolodezi and Yampolovka also continue unabated. No shots of objective control have been received from the Seversk direction. At the same time, Russian troops continue to carry out strikes on AFU positions in the Seversk neighborhoods. In the Chasov Yar direction, fighting continues in Chasov Yar itself. The Russian army fighters are advancing simultaneously from several directions, storming the enemy positions on the eastern bank of the Dnieper Pond and making their way to the territory of the Chasov Yar refractory plant. From the southern outskirts, there was no information about the advance of Russian troops in the area of the Block No. 9 mine. In the Dzerzhinsky direction, after 2 months of intense fighting in residential areas, there is still a relative calm. The situation remains difficult in the Sherbanovka area. Russian troops hold about half of the village, but the enemy retains the ability to conduct raids on positions in the RF armed forces, also occasionally using armored vehicles. Meanwhile, in the Pokrovsko-Mirnograd direction, Ukrainian formations continue to carry out a series of local counterattacks. If recently it became known about the attempts to dislodge the RF armed forces from Kotlino, in the last few days the AFU have been trying to gain a foothold in the western part of the liberated Peshchenoye. All were recorded at least 3 enemy attacks by armored vehicles and BMPs. At the moment, active fighting in the western part of Peshchenoye continues. Russian attack aircrafts are engaged in clearing basements and buildings. In the Novopavlovsk direction, Russian troops hit AFU military equipment in Novosergeyevka near the border with Dnipropetrovsk region. As the front lines are getting closer, the number of strikes and incoming attacks on previously rear areas is also increasing. To the south, on the Andreevsky direction, Russian army fighters knocked out the enemy from a position northwest of Dokny. On the territory of a local school, Russian attack aircraft hoisted Russian flags, marking a stable control over the adjacent territory. At the same time, fighting continues in the eastern part of Andreevka. Also, Russian troops have recently significantly worsened the enemy's position in the vicinity of the village of Ulakli. Due to the location of the settlement in a low-lying area relative to Andreevka, Ukrainian formations are trying to break through on the opposite flank, attacking in the direction of Zelenivka. At the moment, Russian servicemen have repulsed all attacks, while the AFU retreated to their initial positions, suffering casualties. In the Vremievka direction, Russian troops are strengthening the front line of defense at the Vremievka, Bolshaya Novoselka, Novi Kamar line. According to some reports, Russian attack aircraft are still advancing along the Mokry Yali River from the northern direction, but it is not possible to say this with certainty yet. In the Zaporizhia direction, Russian troops are striking AFU positions along the contact line in the Orakovo area. At the same time, Ukrainian formations continue to intensively shell the civilian infrastructure of the liberated part of the Zaporizhia region. Kamenka, Dniprovska, and Energodar came under attack. Drone attacks were also recorded in the villages of Lyubimovka and Burchak of Mikhailovsky district. Under attack for the 4th time in the last week hit the town of Polohi without casualties. In the Kherson direction, Ukrainian formations shelled a residential building in Novaya Kakhovka. 2 civilians received shrapnel wounds. The RF armed forces hit enemy positions near Antonovka and Kherson.